All right, folks, welcome back. We're going to continue the rest of our our seed plant lecture. So now we're looking at these vascular plants that produce seeds. We're no longer looking at non-vascular plants, and we're no longer looking at plants that are producing spores as their reproductive structure. Okay, from now on, again, we're talking just about seeds. And we're now going to talk specifically about the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, because this particular group has a very diverse array of specific adaptations that have evolved over time to make them successful and really quite abundant across the planet. So there's two main kinds of the flowering plants. We've got one kind that's called a monocot and another kind that's called a eudicot. And that really is referring to the type of food source that's available to the individual developing embryo. And so we're going to look at a couple examples of both of those. Oops, I need to click my PowerPoint here. Okay. Now, for both of these kinds of plants in our angiosperms, we've got the ovules, remember, which is the egg cell. They are going to be enclosed within the tissue of the female sporophyte, okay? And that structure that's going to include and sort of encase that ovule is called the carpel. Okay, and that carpel will eventually, so it's sporophyte tissue, but it's going to eventually develop into the fruit that we often consume. Okay, so here's just an example of a flowering plant, and here you can see this is a sugar snap pea. Okay, so this is one kind of fruit that could occur from a flowering plant, and it's in a pod shape, and you can see each of those individual ovules that will become fertilized and then eventually develop into individual fertilized seeds. The whole structure, that whole pea pod structure, is called the fruit. Okay. Now, we think that the ancestor to all current day angiosperms or flowering plants is something called Archaefructus, and this may be the sister clade to all other angiosperms. Okay. Now, we want to look at a little bit of the flower parts. Now, normally, if we were meeting in person, I would be drawing this on the board and have you guys draw the structures. And so I would encourage you to draw these figures. You have a variety of different figures in your textbook, and draw them out, color them. You also might, if you happen to come across some flowers, the Easter weekend coming up, if you happen to get some flowers, dissect them. Enjoy them and then dissect them. Look at the insides of them and see if you can identify some of the male and female parts of the flower, okay? All right, so when we're talking about the female portion of the flower, we're going to be talking specifically about the region called the carpel. Right now, we've got, so the carpel is this bulbous top, okay? There's a neck, and then we have a bulbous base, okay? The bulbous base is called the ovary, and inside of the ovary, we have the ovule, which will eventually become the developing zygote, or will become the seed, right? The neck of the female carpel, or the female part of the plant, is called the style. And the stigma is a very sticky top that allows the pollen to attach itself to the top. So, okay, I have a joke for you now, right? I know you've been waiting all day for this joke, right? But if you're a plant biologist, when we're talking about plant reproduction, it's once you get past the stigma, it's all about style, okay? All right, I hope you found that at least a little bit humorous to lighten your, plant discussion here. All right, now the other component of the flower here is the male component. And the male component of the flower is called the stamen. And there's two parts of the stamen, the filament, which is the long structure, and on the top of each of those individual filaments is the anther, where pollen grains are produced. Okay, so the female part is the carpel, main components, the stigma, style, ovary, and the ovule. And then on the stamen, we have the anther and the filament. Now, another sort of important portion of the plant is, or flower structure, something called the receptacle. Now, the receptacle is the part of the plant that's holding the rest of the flower. And in some fruits, the receptacle is actually part of the fruit. One good example of where the receptacle is part of the fruit would be like a strawberry. A strawberry is actually a swollen receptacle. Okay. All right, so I've already chatted with you about these, but then you guys can have a look on your slides. I put the PowerPoints up there so that you have some sort of definitions for these different flower parts. Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about a little bit about this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because I don't think it's super important that you need to know all the details of this. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, and don't worry about the details of that. So we're talking here about a little bit of gametophyte reproduction, or I should say gametophyte production, and then how we would eventually get sperm into the system. And we're going to talk a little more in depth by this reproductive functioning in a few slides here. So one of the important parts, if we look at an individual ovule, okay, so flowering plants might have multiple ovules in one ovary, okay? Now we have these individual ovules, and there's going to be an opening called the micropyle, and this opening is going to be the place where we're going to see the male pollen tube insert itself so that sperm can then be transferred to that individual ovule. Okay. Don't worry about the number of megaspores that are produced, the number of haploid nuclei. Don't worry about that. We're not going to talk about that at all. Okay. All right. We also have inside that ovule, the main part that's called the female gametophyte is called the embryo sac. So it's without, you know, the tissue and things like that. Now, again, don't worry about the text on this slide. We're going to mostly focus on the reproductive cycle for flowering plants. And we'll talk about what this idea of polar nuclei are here in just a minute. And also, you know, what other cells are inside of that egg. Okay, so there are 8 haploid cells inside each and every single ovule. Okay, so we're going to look at that in just a minute. So here they are in some words, but here we have our complete life cycle of our flowering plant. Now what I want you to focus on is right here. Okay, we're going to focus on the female gametophyte. So we're inside of our flower. So here's your ovary, just to kind of give you a perspective. Here's the ovary. And inside of the ovary, we're just showing one ovule because otherwise it gets too busy. So what happens inside of the ovule is that you get production of this particular cell that contains 8 haploid nuclei. And the haploid nuclei, we have an egg cell, and on either side of our egg cell, we have what are called synergids. And that was from that previous slide that we just looked at. So synergids, I think I have them on here. Yes, synergids right here. All right, now the next, so that takes up 3 of those 8 haploid nuclei, egg, and then synergids on either side of the egg. The egg is what's going to develop into the embryo. The synergids, we have no clue what they do. Now on the opposite end of the egg, there are 3 haploid cells called antipodals. So again, I'll go back here, and here we go. Antipodals, again, we have 0 idea what their function is, and they may not have a function. Now the last 2, so far we've talked about 6 of the haploid nuclei. The last 2 haploid nuclei within the female gametophyte are the 2 polar nuclei that hang out kind of in the center. Now those 2 polar nuclei are what are going to eventually develop into the food source for the developing embryo. Okay. Now over here we can see kind of what happens with our pollen cell. Okay, so when we're kind of producing pollen, pollen is not necessarily mature until it divides and starts to produce a cell that can grow a pollen tube. Okay, so inside the individual pollen, there's a couple different cells. They go through some mitotic divisions, so just cellular division. And then once that pollen lands on top of the stigma, it starts to grow a tube that grows all the way down the style and then inserts at the bottom at that micropyle end of the ovule. Remember I showed you where that opening was on those individual ovules? So once the pollen tube inserts itself, 2 sperm nuclei come down through the tube and go in to fertilize some of the haploid nuclei. 1 sperm is responsible for fertilizing the egg. and that becomes the zygote or the embryo. The second sperm nuclei combines with 2 polar nuclei to form what we call the endosperm, a triploid food source for the developing embryo. Okay, and then once we have fertilization of those 2 separate events, now we can produce our structure that we call the seed, which can then develop into another adult sporophyte. All right, now, as I said before, I would encourage you guys to kind of draw that particular part of the cycle out, you know, thinking about how the ovule looks and then how the different nuclei are fertilized, because that's kind of an important process that's unique to flowering plants. All right, now I talked to you a little bit about the pollen. Don't worry so much here, except that the pollen is going to provide 2 sperm nuclei. Okay. All right, now there's lots of ways that pollination can, there's lots of ways that pollination can occur. Right? Humans will physically take pollen from one plant and place it on another plant. Wind can transfer it. Okay. Many other organisms can transfer the pollen. So there's a variety of different ways that pollen can get to the female stigma and then fertilize the ovules. Okay, and now I had said this before, but that the pollen tube is what's going to transfer the 2 sperm nuclei to the ovule. There are no flagella on the sperm, just like we saw no flagella on our gymnosperms. Okay, the flagella on sperm is a ancestral trait. All right, now, remember I was telling you, I'm going to go ahead and put these up. Remember I was telling you when we were thinking about that life cycle, the reproductive event that's super important in angiosperms is something called double fertilization. Fertilization number 1, sperm nuclei combines with egg in the ovule to form the zygote. That's fertilization 1. Fertilization number 2, sperm nuclei combines with 2 polar nuclei, making a triploid endosperm, right? So inside a seed, you not only have a diploid zygote, you also have a triploid endosperm, okay? And this is a great system, right? Because once that seed gets deposited somewhere, it doesn't have to find food right away, right? The food usually comes through photosynthetic production. But, you know, before you have leaves, it's kind of difficult to do photosynthesis, right? So the initial nutritive value that's contained within a seed is going to provide that nutrition needed to generate those first photosynthetic leaves that can then allow that plant to continue to grow and develop. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit more about our seeds. Okay, don't worry about the seed coat. We already talked earlier in the lecture when we talked about seeds in general. We recall that we were talking about the seed coat that provides protection for the individual seed. And then we also mentioned that we have our developing embryo in there that has a embryonic root, embryonic leaves, and then a food source inside of there. All right, now, seeds are super important. We talked about this earlier in that first lecture. They can allow the seed to survive during really crummy conditions, okay? Drought, flood, right? There's a variety of different conditions that a dormant seed can survive, right? They also protect the young plant when it's most vulnerable, right? So basically, mitotic divisions stop or halt within the seed when it goes dormant. The seed also provides food. As I said before, it's going to provide that first food for the embryo until it can produce its own. And the seeds are also really important to help move the embryo around, okay? The coating or the outside covering of the seed may have a fruit on it, and that's going to be really helpful to move the embryo around, okay? Now, as I said before, remember the development of the embryo halts or stops, okay, at a certain point once the seed's produced, okay? And there's no more metabolism until that seed starts to germinate, okay? Usually the factors that induce germination of seed is that the seed needs enough water and oxygen to be able to reach that embryo, which will then sort of kickstart the germination process. There are seeds on the planet that are viable, meaning they could still germinate, but they have remained dormant for thousands of years. I think that's kind of impressive. All right, let's look at some unique adaptations among some of our seed plants. Here we've got some cones, and this particular, like ponderosa pine, okay? These cones have to experience, or excuse me, once the seeds are released, the seeds have to experience a fire event, okay? So the cones don't open until fire has occurred in the region, and the seed has to experience that heat and fire before they're going to be able to germinate. Okay, so that's kind of a unique adaptation. Now we also have a variety of other plants that have some really specialized fruits. And the fruit portion develops from a mature ovary. Okay, so the seed is an ovule that's been fertilized, and the fruit portion that we might consume is a mature ovary, right? Now, we can have fruits that don't have seed development. Take bananas, for example. Bananas are produced by grafting plants. And so those are all asexual propagation, okay, when we think about bananas. All right, now here's a nice image of the female portion of the plant. It's just a zoomed up image, very similar to what we were looking at earlier, but you can really see the stigma, the style, and the ovary, and then inside, once we have had fertilization occur, you see that seed that's halted development. Okay. Now, just to give you a couple examples of some of the fruits you might see, you may not have known because we call tomatoes a vegetable, but in botanical terms, a tomato is a fruit and specifically called a berry. Another example are legumes. This would include things like lentils, okay, garbanzo beans, and here we have a pea. A couple other kinds of fruits, we have something called a drupe. That would be like one giant pit of a peach or a nectarine. A samara, these are some of the wind dispersed seed types that you might see. We have some other fruits, so this would be an aggregate fruit. So each individual little bulbous fruity portion of those blackberries or strawberries, that was an individual flower that developed, okay? And then we also have what we call a multiple fruit. And so again, these guys also have individual flowers, okay? All right, now, there's a variety of ways by which seeds can be transported from one place to the next. Lots of organisms eat them, like birds and other mammals. And it's really important for a seed to sometime experience the inside of a gut in order to be able to grow and germinate. They usually have to be scarred in some way. So the inside of the gut is, you know, pH of like 4. So that's super acidic. And some other organisms have even more acidic digestive tracts. So that's kind of helpful, okay, for many seeds. They need to experience that scarring that would occur through traveling through a digestive tract. Now, you have probably been annoyed by a variety of different seeds that have spines. You know, the sandburrs that stick in your foot, they hurt, right? But you know, those seeds are well adapted to attaching themselves to things, including you. Sometimes seeds are dispersed by organisms that like to bury the seeds in storage bins called caches. There's a lot of organisms that participate in that behavior, from rodents, which would include, you know, anything from kangaroo rats to squirrels to mice, but also bird species. Many of the oak trees are planted by blue jays that cache oak seeds. Some seeds blow in the wind, and some seeds can move and float along the water. Okay. Now here's just a couple other examples of different dispersal types, right? So here you can see some nice fleshy fruit that will probably attract somebody who likes to eat the fruit. And then here we have some super spiky seeds that just love to attach themselves to organisms. Dandelion's an excellent example of a wind dispersed seed. So you can see its little floaty parachute and then the individual seed there. And then coconuts most certainly pass through water. There's lots of coconuts that are floating around in the ocean before they ever get deposited on land where they could potentially germinate again. And that's the end of our show. And I will talk to you all again soon.